First of all, let me apologize for the quality of this particular video. I am actually sitting on my couch. It is a ridiculous hour of the morning, and I just got around to doing this video that I promised someone that I would do uh, yesterday. And I apologize for not getting it out, but hopefully it's out early enough that most of you will be okay with it. Your video, first of all, hi. This is the actual me in real time, as opposed to the older videos that you are watching. That basically, I'd be repeating the same thing. Hopefully, they've been helpful. I will be putting up the medieval and the Renaissance period here this morning as well. But somebody asked me if I would do a video about two things. One, I've been asked to do a paper about the paper. And then the other one is literally, I think the way that they put it was Rhetoric for Dummies, a video basically that just gets this down to a particular level that is more understandable or accessible to all of you. I understand that. So I think a lot of people need that. Even, literally. People who've been studying rhetoric for a couple of years often say, well, can you just sort of dumb this down for me a little bit? I'm not really sure I understand it. People who are professors in our department who say, I never understood it. I don't really want anything to do with it. I kind of feel about rhetoric the same way I feel about numbers. I don't do numbers. So if you don't believe me, ask my husband. So today, what I'm going to do is cover two things: the paper, and also sort of dumb down the rhetoric for dummies, kind of quick and dirty thing. Now, for those of you who have already taken the test, the scores aren't bad, so I assume that we're doing okay. If you've turned in your paper, great. Those grades should be done by the end of the week. And of course, the test will close on Friday. So you still have plenty of time to get the test done. You have unlimited time on the test, but you can only take it once, unless we've made other arrangements for some reason. Or if there is a test fail, often it'll indicate that to me. So if there's an emergency, obviously we'll deal with that. But for right now, your test is up and ready for you to take. If you don't have access to that, please let me know as soon as possible. Also, those of you who have not turned in your paper yet, there is no deadline. This class runs till the end of July, and I can get grades in as late as next August, and you'd still be fine. And so trying to shove 16 weeks worth of rhetoric into 8 weeks is very difficult. And I don't take that lightly. And I hope that you don't take that lightly either. And what that means is that I'm going to help you get through this class as best I can. So hopefully you've seen that, and hopefully you've seen that effort from me. So here goes. The paper, the main questions that people have had for me are about sources and about how to find sources for this paper. My interest is not in number of sources. My interest is in quality of sources. I'm looking for you to get as close to original text or people writing about the original text as you could possibly get. So, for example, if you're writing about the five canons, you may consult Aristotle, Quintilian, Cicero. Those texts are available online. So they're literally they're not antiquated, excuse me. They're classical texts, so they're available online. So you can find Aristotle's on Rhetoric, and it's a printed text that's been, was orally handed down, and then somebody wrote some stuff down, and we've translated it 3 times, and now here it is. Generally, the best recommended interpreted text is a book by Kennedy, who interprets Aristotle's On Rhetoric. If you don't want to go to the book, you go to the library and get a book, which I don't blame you if you don't. Most of the classical texts are, in fact, available online. So if you find a text such as as Rhetoric or the Phaedrus or any other piece of work that we've read online, that's probably acceptable. What's not acceptable is to find, somebody else's lecture about, about Aristotle or about ethos or whatever it is that you're covering. It's not okay to use those lectures or to use philosophy.com or those kinds of sources that are not edited, are not checked, and that have not been in some way verified. So, how many sources do you need? As many as it takes to demonstrate that you understand the concept or idea that you're writing about. Some people have asked me, can I do a compare and contrast? Absolutely. If it's easier for you to think about things in terms of comparing and contrasting ideas or even philosophies or philosophers, that's fine. Just don't do more work than you need to. Just demonstrate to me you have knowledge about the subject or about the thing that you're talking about. And, an explication paper is just that. You are demonstrating to me that you're able to read material and consolidate it and send it back to me in a way that demonstrates that you understand it. So this paper is very boring. This paper is not very creative, and it's pretty much you taking stuff in and mixing it up and then funneling it back out to me to say, hey, I understand it in this way. And yes, sometimes you're going to write that you agree or disagree with some things or whatnot, and that's fine too. So whatever you decide that you want to do is good. Other questions that I've gotten on the paper have been about topics. I just encourage everybody to narrow, don't go too big. 5 pages is not that long, but if you have individual questions, by all means, email me. I have not been great about getting back on email, but it's been better than Blackboard because they switched Blackboard to the cloud, and I think a lot gets missed. I don't get notifications. I don't get, emails. If I don't go in and constantly check piece by piece, I miss things. So, text me, email me. Some of you have already gotten into that habit with me where you say, hey, I sent you an email. I haven't gotten a response. And I go in and I go, oh, yeah, there it is. And sometimes it's in my bulk folder. Sometimes I missed it in other emails or whatnot. So, bug me until you get an answer. That's kind of why I'm here. All right. Any other questions on the paper? Feel free to ask me. I will also immediately go to Blackboard after I post this video. The second thing I was going to talk about was rhetoric for dummies. So here we go. this is as good as I can get it, I think. So a lot of people, like I said, ask me, can you put rhetoric into sort of a 10-second, what's the shortest elevator speech you could give me about rhetoric? And that is really difficult to do. Some people view rhetoric as a thing, an object. So for example, a speech, that's rhetoric, or a text of some sort, or a movie or whatever. That's a piece of rhetoric. Some people view rhetoric as a methodology for understanding things. Well, I'm going to view this through a rhetorical lens, meaning I'm looking for all of the persuasion that's going on, and I'm analyzing how effective that persuasion is. And that, therefore, it's something that people use as a critical lens to understand speeches, texts, sometimes images, even plays, music, whatever. Some people view rhetoric more as just as persuasion. So any persuasive speech is considered rhetoric to them. So I don't think that you should get tied down and get worried about, oh, I'm not sure that I understand all of rhetoric, because no one person actually does. And that's a fact. That's a fact. I mean, if you read Aristotle's On Rhetoric, which is supposed to be the book that tells you what rhetoric is, there's multiple definitions and ways of using rhetoric and what it can do and what it can't do. And at one point he says that if a person is speaking and they don't have goodwill towards their audience, if they are lying or if they are misleading their audience in some way, or they don't demonstrate that they want the best for their audience, then they are not practicing rhetoric. And people get very confused by that. And Aristotle's just trying to say that there's an ethic to rhetoric, that rhetoric is used for a specific reason. So what is rhetoric used for? I always go back to Aristotle's definition. I think it's the best one. I think it's the easiest one. Rhetoric is 3 parts to this definition: the art, skill of knowing. So it's a talent, if you want to look at it that way. It's something that you have a skill to learn, the art or skill of knowing all the means of persuasion. So he's not just talking about words. He's not just talking about how they're put together. He's not just talking about speaking. He's not just talking about one particular part of any of that. He's talking about all of the means of persuasion. So if you think about any persuasive situation, any situation that you're in where someone is speaking, is trying to be persuasive, there's a lot of things that influence how persuasive they are. Um, some people will only respond to good looking people, to people who are dressed a particular way, to people who have power over them, or people who have power over them that they don't like, even. That changes the persuasive dynamic. So, all of the means of persuasion, and then he adds in any particular situation. And it's important, that part there, that third part, in any particular situation, is really important because he's really trying to say that, in the end, uh, rhetoric occurs in a moment. It's situationally based, it's environmentally based, or it's context based. It's happening in a moment. And so, in order to understand all of the means of persuasion, you have to understand that particular instance, that particular moment, and understand that just because something works in one instance doesn't mean it's going to work in another. And that's absolutely true. We've seen that. It's not always effective, no matter what. So you have to take into consideration the situation. So the art or skill of knowing a particular instance all the means of persuasion, the art or skill of knowing all the means of persuasion in any particular instance. And there's different ways of wording that, obviously, but basically those three parts come from Aristotle. And to me, it's the easiest to understand definition. That might not be the case for you, but I guarantee you, if you Google definitions of rhetoric, you will find literally hundreds. And so you will confuse yourself. So I like to ground the class in that classical tradition of the Neo-Aristotelian view of rhetoric. So, what is rhetoric? It's the art, skill of knowing in a particular instance all the means of persuasion. That sounds like, oh, well, that's just understanding speech. That's PR. That's communication. And that's what we do if you get a communication degree. To an extent, that's true. But Aristotle puts a few other things, conditions onto the definition that I think are important and can easily be missed. Number one, he says it's for the purpose of mass influence. So when you go to a club, and you're trying to choose what partner you'd like to dance with next, that is, you go up and persuade them to dance with you. That is not the practice of rhetoric. That's interpersonal communication. Rhetoric occurs at a mass level. The second thing is he says that there's only 3 times when rhetoric is absolutely necessary, and that's when it's used. And that's the ceremonial, the ceremonial or the epidictic, the forensic, or the sort of courtroom exercise, and the deliberative, or sort of the policy deliberation that he talks about. And he says rhetoric only occurs in those 3 instances. So a lot of times you'll find that people who study rhetoric also study politics, or they study social movements. And a lot of people say, why is that the case? I mean, not all rhetoric is inherently political. Not all rhetoric occurs ceremonially. Yeah, that's true. But for the most part, those of us who have been taught classical Neo-Aristotelian tradition of rhetoric, we will say that for the most part, we're also interested in political rhetoric. Like myself, my PhD is essentially in political rhetoric. Then, of course, I head up the socio-political communication major here. So those two are tied together. Why are they tied together? They're tied together because Aristotle said that a rhetorician is the person who explains the government to the citizens. So rhetoricians literally are supposed to help communication between citizens and a government. And a lot of people say that's crazy talk because that means journalists, that means news anchors, that means newspaper writers, that means anyone who's reporting on anything that's happening in the government. That's not just government act. So, yes, we tend to say, hey, everything. And then I don't know about you, but every time I go to a movie, I look at it obsessively and think, what message is this sending? Particularly if I take my 8-year-old with me, I want to know, what is this message that they're sending? Is it the right one that I want them to have? Is this a good political message? And so on. Because all messages inherently say something about society and how it functions and how we work together, and that is kind of the definition of politics. So rhetoric is not everything. There are things that are not rhetoric. And the easiest way to define that is, so you look again at Aristotle, who says there are three things that are always required in order to make something persuasive. Aside from this being mass influence, aside from it being most of the time ceremonial or political, aside from the fact that rhetoric generally deals with the relationship between a government and its people, aside from all of that, there are three elements that must be present in order for rhetoric to exist. What is it? What are those three things? And this is a lot of people say, well, this is in order for rhetoric to be successful. Sure. But also, if these three elements are not present, you're not persuasive, you're not doing persuasion, and I'm not looking at it as rhetoric. Because Aristotle said, and this is key, that rhetoric is about those things which are probable. That's important. Rhetoric is a discussion of things, it's about things that are probable or likely. It is not about things that have already been determined to be true. So when he talks about artificial proofs, I can't remember if the book uses those words or artistic and inartistic. Inartistic and inartificial are the same. Artistic and artificial are the same. When he talks about inartistic or inartificial proofs, he's talking about science. He's talking about the things that make truth outside of humans, that humans don't need to necessarily interpret, that humans don't discover any other way other than empirically. We witness it, or we feel it, or we smell it, or we taste it, or whatever. So those kinds of things are not debatable. So when somebody says to me, oh, well, you can teach me how to debate whether or not the sky is blue or not. No, I don't need to debate that with you. It's not a debatable point. It's not probable as much as it is just, a reflection of the ocean. There you go. That seems pretty well established. Gravity is pretty well established. I mean, I think that one of the best statements I ever got from one of my mentors was, difference between an artificial proof and an inartificial proof is very simple. It's demonstrated by a parachute. If you go onto a plane and you jump out of that plane, you can, without a parachute, excuse me, you jump out of that plane without a parachute, you can rhetorically construct a net all you want. You could talk about it and describe it and everything else, but you're still going to die because gravity is still going to have you hit the ground at a force that you will not be able to survive it. So we can't construct things out of thin air. And we can't construct arguments out of thin air. There has to be some basis for that. So Aristotle says, if somebody challenges, will the sun rise tomorrow? We certainly can call it debatable that the sun doesn't rise, that the earth spins and it goes around the sun, and that's what makes it appear as if the sun rises. Fine. But it doesn't change the fact that the sun goes through that process and that we call that a day. And we call the Earth's rotation a day and the Earth's rotation around the sun a year. That those kinds of things have been established because we've assigned them to be true. Very much the same if you go out and pound your head against a rock, it's going to hurt. Different levels of pain. Sure, maybe I can talk myself out of it if I'm Jessica Alba, but for the most part, these are scientifically proven to be true. Or if an apple falls out of a tree, it's going to fall to the ground. It's not going to float up in the air because of gravity. Those aren't debatable things. Those are artificial. Those are external to humans. Artificial proofs are what make rhetoric because they are the things that are human made. But what are those things that are debatable? Um, we should go to war. We shouldn't go to war. Two oppositional things, equal oppositionals, really. Um, Guilty, innocent, equal oppositionals, right? Anytime you have these equal oppositional points that come here, right here where my middle fingers are touching, right in between there is what Aristotle calls a point of stasis. That point of stasis is where debate begins. That's where rhetoric begins. So stasis is where rhetoric begins because it's a debatable proposition. It's about probabilities and likelihoods. It's not about truths and untruths in the sense of the inartificial proofs. So the proofs of why something is or is not one way or another um, are human made. They're not out there. Um, Debatable things are the subject of rhetoric. Non-debatable things are not the subject of rhetoric. So um, if I put what is it, vinegar and baking soda together, I'm going to get like a reaction. Know that. Now, the way I experience that reaction might be different than the way you do, but other than that, the reaction is there. It's still the same. It doesn't change. What does change is the way that we might describe it. So, what are those artificial proofs or artistic proofs? Ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is not just ethics. It's about having goodwill towards your audience. It's about establishing a credibility with your audience because you indicate goodwill. So you might say, why do I have to dress up to give a speech? That doesn't make any sense. Like, yeah, of course I'm going to dress up when I go to work. Why here? Why can't I wear my pajamas and my slippers or my sweatpants and my Uggs? Why can't I do that? Well, you can, but what it shows to your audience is that you don't care as much about them as if you attempted to dress appropriately or to look as if you are attempting to create ethos of professionalism. So, it's not about dressing up, it's about what you're demonstrating to your audience vis-a-vis your ethos, your overall character, your competence. So it's about that credibility that's made up of character. Do you have goodwill towards your audience? Are you a good person? And competence, do you know what you're talking about? The second one, which would be logos, is actually not logic. The word logos actually means word in Greek. And Aristotle was really trying to demonstrate that you have to be able to demonstrate reasoning through language. So that's what logos is about. It's about how you demonstrate your reasoning to reach a particular conclusion through words, through language. Obviously, that we use the word logic for that. But it's a little too convenient and too short-sighted to say it's just logic. It's actually being able to demonstrate that reasoning through language. Finally, pathos, which of course is my least favorite and least favorite of most people, because it's just considered emotion. The way we describe it, to say something is pathetic is to say that it's deserving of attention, of emotion. And that's a puppy dog. Anybody can establish that. You could put a baby in my arms or a puppy in my arms, and I'm like, oh, look, I have feelings. That's not what we're talking about here. We're really talking about passion towards the subject matter more than we are about the audience here. We're talking about passion for the subject matter that is demonstrated to the audience to show that you care about them and that you care about the subject matter and about giving them correct information. So those three things have to work together in order for you to have good rhetoric, persuasive rhetoric, effective rhetoric. Rhetoric is about mass influence, and rhetoric generally is aimed towards the political or the social. So it's about mass influence, getting groups together or large group influence for the purpose of persuading people to take some action together. I hope that narrows the scope of rhetoric a little bit for you. Sure, marketing a product is somewhat rhetorical, but really that's just about persuasion. It's one thing for me to get you to do something. It's a whole other thing if I get you to do it and to enjoy it to learn from it, to do it again, right? And so there's a huge difference between that sort of short term getting you to buy something, for example, versus long term getting you to only buy a certain product for the rest of your life, for example. Um, so that's really the difference between what I call simple persuasion and rhetoric. So I hope this helps a bit, and I hope I dumbed it down a little bit for you. Um, Basically, Plato hates rhetoric. You read that in Phaedrus. Aristotle defines rhetoric. Socrates uses rhetoric to demonstrate how he defended himself, and also to talk about what the job of a rhetorician is supposed to be, which is to teach the next generation how to be good citizens. And the sophists, as sort of a class of people, still exist today, utilize rhetoric for different purposes. And the fact that it could be used for good or evil is why Plato hates it. Um, Aristotle says if you use rhetoric for bad ends or towards evil ends, then you're not practicing rhetoric. You're practicing coercion or some other type of persuasion with a bad end. The only way to practice rhetoric is to have goodwill towards your audience, to want the best for them, demonstrate that to them by utilizing good logic based on inartificial proofs and styling it in such a way that you utilize the artificial proofs for the purpose of persuasion. So let me know if that helps. And I'm going to go ahead and put this video up, and I will put up the medieval period, the Renaissance period, and I think that just those three today for you guys. If you have any questions, let me know. I will check in with you again tomorrow.